2030. 2030.
Saudi Arabia, the 2030 fund,
it's a big
a lot of excitement
this
around
transformational
specifically.
change. Every aspect of the kingdom, economic, social, cultural, religious.
The 2030.
The 2030.
This is the 2030.
Yalla, 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 yalla.
Hala Walla Doctora, episode 12. We had a debate of the 2030 podcast. We had to debate and do a little research as to what episode we actually are on. It is 12. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I am doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, especially with the knowledge that we are on episode 12 and not 9 or 13 as we may have thought at the time. I'm doing especially well, of course, because we have a very good conversation coming up on Saudi Arabia's real estate sector with a repeat guest contributor, recurring guest contributor, Faisal Durrani from Knight Frank Middle East. He's a partner and head of MENA Research. We get to talk with Faisal about a bunch of different things related to real estate in Saudi Arabia and actually even beyond that. Really great conversation. And of course, also doing well because we had a great conversation earlier this week with Manal Dwayan, leading Saudi artist. So we've been busy. So yeah, doing well.
Excellent. And how's St. Michael's?
St. Michael's is heaven on earth. The weather is perfect. We've had a really good run. The grass is so green. The golf course looks amazing. I'm trying not to think about it too much while we do this podcast, or I will never really get focused again. It's just going to wander out the window, but everything is great. And how is London? What's the temp like there? Are we summer hot yet? Or?
No, I think summer hot's not in the books this year. It dropped today. Like it was warmer yesterday than it was today. So, but it's sunny, so that's okay.
This is the season for both of us, Washington, D.C. area, London, other places in Europe where Saudis say, hey, the weather seems pretty nice there. I think maybe we'll do a visit. So safe travels to everybody leaving Saudi Arabia this summer to beat the heat. And I think I will be back in a few weeks, but we will see on that. Anyway, let's get to a deep dive, episode 11.
So on June 5th, the United Nations celebrated World Environment Day, which inspires my deep dive today about ESG and sustainability reporting in Saudi Arabia. I may have mentioned this in the past, but I used to be corporate social responsibility manager for 5 years at Rawabi Holding in the Eastern Province in Saudi, which is a diversified holding company that operates in marine services, construction, lots of oil and gas services, etc. And I was a corporate social responsibility manager. So I ran a lot of social programs, but I also was heavily involved in the sustainability initiative. And I have worked in CSR and sustainability for so many years and continue to do that. So it's something that I really enjoy thinking about and talking about in addition to a lot of the work that I do. And actually the youth empowerment stuff that I used to do at Rawabi is what inspired my PhD. So it's still quite relevant and integrated. But I wanted to talk a bit about sustainability reporting in Saudi, which as this financial year concludes for many companies in the kingdom, companies are reporting. There's a lot of that in the news. I wanted to shed a little bit of light on another type of reporting. So not just the financial reports, but what is gaining momentum within the kingdom. So ESG is not necessarily always seen as a positive thing. A lot of companies are accused of kind of greenwashing their books by presenting things that they do related to the environment, their governance, and their social contributions. But it's something that's still gaining momentum around the world. I think there are a few countries where sustainability reporting is in decline, but more than $35 trillion of assets worldwide are said to be monitored using some sort of sustainability lens. And there's an increase in 55% in reporting since 2016. Investors, banks, businesses, they've all signed up to a series of different alliances. Bosses of S&P 500 and S&P 500 companies now mention ESG, according to The Economist, 9 times a quarter in all earnings calls on average, compared with just once, if at all, in 2017. So within Saudi Arabia, this is something that's also starting to come up more often. So ESG reporting, it's also widely known as ESG disclosure or sustainability reporting, is a type of public reporting that discloses a company's performance on the environment, social, and governance criteria. There is not one standard way to report on this, but there are several standards that companies can and do follow. The Global Reporting Initiative is one. UN Sustainability Development, the SDGs, Sustainability Development Goals, are another set of standards that can be used to report on how companies are performing in those three areas. And why this can be really important in Saudi is that it encourages companies to be more transparent about how they do business, and it also encourages them to consider aspects of the company management that they may not have paid attention to in the past. As the kingdom opens up, this can be really appealing to foreign investors. And ESG is really important for funds and investors that are looking specifically at companies and how they comply with different regulations. So it's becoming increasingly controversial as well. And I think that despite that, there are a lot of really good things that can happen when companies start to introspect and think about how they are running their business. So besides the regulatory push, increased demand from socially conscious investors and consumers and growing green finance initiatives have spurred an interest in ESG reporting. The MENA ESG 2023 report by Bain & Company highlighted that investors in the Middle East are increasingly integrating ESG risks and opportunities into their decision-making and are committing to more net zero targets. In Saudi Arabia in 2017, the Capital Market Authority, or the CMA, issued a new corporate governance rules, which would enhance the rights of shareholders and board members. And the CMA also issued kind of guidance on how companies can report. So they address critical ESG areas such as conflicts of interest, board member responsibilities, internal auditing, social responsibility initiatives. Publicly listed companies are also required to publish non-financial ESG reports in certain instances. Moreover, the CMA issued the Corporate Governance Code in 2023, highlighting standards for board directors, disclosure requirements, and shareholder rights. The code aims to increase accountability, improve foreign investment, and protect investors. Greater ESG framework regulations across the GCC have also led to a greater integration of ESG practices into company strategies. So according to 2023 PwC Middle East ESG report, 64% of respondents reported having an ESG strategy in place, and only 7% said their company had no ESG strategy. So within Saudi again. So I think when I said that companies were required to report, that's not in Saudi, but that's more kind of looking at the GCC markets as a whole. In Saudi, it's not a regulatory requirement at the moment, but there's talk that it might be. The country's stock exchange has published ESG guidance that includes a list of common ESG themes such as labor management, controversial sourcing, supply chain, labor standards, and tax transparency. And according to the stock exchange site, in 2018, Tadawul, the Saudi exchange, which was formerly known as the Saudi Stock Exchange, became a partner exchange supporting the UN Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative and working to promote ESG awareness initiatives and encourage sustainable investment in collaboration with market participants such as issuers and investors. Since then, Saudi Exchange has engaged with listed companies, standard setters, index providers, ratings providers, investors, and other stock exchanges through a myriad of mediums to help advance ESG disclosure in the Saudi capital market. The exchange is focused on raising awareness and encouraging listed companies to disclose ESG. So you can see that there's a lot happening in the area, and to advance ESG concerns in the Saudi capital market. Saudi Exchange encourages listed companies to identify, prioritize, and assess the ESG factors most critical to their business. I will say that it is not easy, and organizations are embracing this, but it is difficult. And I think arguably the G of ESG has been a more predominant historic concern for Middle Eastern investors looking to screen for alcohol, gambling, tobacco. But the full range of ESG factors is now becoming more and more relevant to both Middle Eastern and global investors investing in the region. And companies operating in Saudi and the broader Middle East tend to have lower environment, social, and governance and overall ESG scores compared to counterparts around the world. I think You can think about things like the Saudi Green Initiative that includes the first wave of over 60 programs and projects representing a total investment of more than 700 billion riyals or $187 billion to boost the green economy. And it's helping position the country as an international leader in sustainability, arguably. So there's a lot that's happening in that space. And a lot of companies are starting to produce year-on-year ESG reports so they can really actually start to compare their performance, from previous years and set standards and targets that are relevant to their own industry and their own operations. You can read ESG reports from the Saudi Electric Company, different banks, most of them have ESG reports. Riyadh Bank, for instance, has one, and more private sector companies, not listed private sector companies, are starting to produce some as well. So I just thought it would be kind of important to highlight that this is something that is happening. For a lot of companies, it still really is about their corporate social responsibility, which is oftentimes their charitable contributions, but they're starting to move into a slightly more sophisticated space and use some of these indices and standards to disclose their business operations from an ESG perspective.
Very good, Hannah. I think one of the challenges with ESG in general is that it's somewhat hard to understand in terms of how the impact is actually felt. And to some people, when they hear ESG, they think of ESG investing, and then that's where it sort of stops. And they think that that's investing that will help save the planet, will help fight climate change. And actually, that's kind of not what it is or how it works. And so that's where a little bit of the challenge comes in, because people say, oh, it's ESG, and like that means we're like covered or we're all good in that respect. And actually it's sort of the beginning, as you know, and I know you know this, but it's sort of interesting to think about because, for example, BlackRock had a fund and it was sort of an ESG fund and they were still investing in oil companies. And so there was a lot of people saying, wait a minute, I thought this was an environment fund. And it's like, well, not really. But Saudi Arabia, so there's really two things. There's the private sector investing and what they invest in, and is it governed by ESG, and then how is it governed, and what are the sort of things that are measurable. And then there is government policy and international policy on climate change and fighting global warming. And those actually are separate things, even though they share a similar goal. So so it's interesting to see Saudi Arabia's private sector looking at the government, looking at things like what the PIF is doing, looking at the Saudi Green Initiative and the Riyadh Green Initiative and, net zero targets by 2060, I think it is. And they're getting a signal from them that this is something that they're interested in, even as the largest oil producer in the world. This is what they recognize as the future. So for the private sector, they get these signals and say, okay, this is something we want to be a part of. So you have globally 78% of executives saying ESG is either a part of what they're doing or they're looking at incorporating it imminently. So this was a bit of a rambling response to you, because I think it's interesting to see where it's going in Saudi Arabia, because you have very interested private sector entities doing it. And yet it's like still kind of anomalous as to what it is globally, and people are trying to make sure that they're all on the same page with it. So sorry about that rambling answer there. But
no.
It's
I think
topic.
you touched on a lot of really important points. I think ESG rubs a lot of people the wrong way, especially investors, right? Because it does mean that you're presenting something that maybe isn't even what you should be doing as a company. You're a profit-seeking company. You should be serving your shareholders, right? And, arguably, shareholders are not just what you should be looking at. You should be thinking about your stakeholders, and your stakeholders include the economy at large, which includes other communities. It includes the environment, and it includes kind of, just in general, people that might be second or third level kind of affected by what you're doing at the second or third level. I fall into the second camp a lot more. I do think that, yes, while not harming profit, you should also be thinking about your stakeholders, because that will ultimately harm your shareholders if you're not taking care of the rest of the communities and environment that are around you. And I also think that there's a lot of confusion about ESG and being just an environmental thing. So again, let's remember that it's environment, social, and governance impacts, right? So with the environmental, yes, you are thinking about climate change, energy efficiency, water, air, carbon emissions, biodiversity, etc. But it doesn't mean that you're going to stop all negative impacts. It means you're going to look at what is material for your company and how that is impacting the environment and how you can reduce the negative impacts, and then how you can set targets to continuously reduce your negative impacts. So, and also how you can improve that space as much as possible. From a social perspective, you're thinking a lot about human rights, especially if you're looking at the Global Reporting Initiative standards, or you're starting to think about the Sustainability Development Goals. And that means you're thinking about how people are impacted by your work, right? At the community level, but also at the employee level. So with Saudi companies, a lot of times what they start reporting on is how many women they're employing and how many Saudis they're training, because that again is looking at the communities that they serve and how they can maximize impact there. You're thinking about labor standards, but you're also thinking about customer satisfaction. You're also thinking about the supply chain and thinking about who you're dealing with, right? And who's in your logistics network, and how to make sure that they're also treating their employees fairly, that they're compensating them well. And so I do think that when you have the Saudi Exchange and the CMA coming in and putting these standards in, it's a really easy way to say, listen, we need to really enhance our way of doing business so we meet global standards. And these are standards that make like good business sense, whether or not we've been doing them under ESG, sustainability, or whatever. This is something that we would like all companies to start doing better in these areas. And so I think it's a really good step in that way. And then of course you have the G, which is the governance, and that's making sure that you're transparent, you're combating corruption, you're doing things in a way that is kind of following industry best practices, board composition, company leadership, battling things like bribery. So ESG is not a bad thing, but pretending that you're doing good things when you're not, I think, is what's bad. So I think that learning from what's inside these standards is really important, and thinking about how to take businesses forward.
Yeah, that was just a really articulate and intelligent way to say what I kind of rambled about right before. And I think that's really good. And I think part of my point was just that it's very tough when you have at least these two things, the E and the S, which are intricately, intertwined and codependent, but they're very separate. So like somebody like me may focus on the environment versus the social versus the other way around. And then you have the governance part. It's like, this is a big thing that we're trying to wrangle into one term. And so I think that's where some confusion comes from. Interesting, because in the VC world, it seems like climate investing has been around for a while. It actually still is very much picking up. I mean, $3.2 billion was raised last year with 18 new funds. And then you had this year, $4.1 billion for 16 funds just in the first quarter. So it's starting at least either hitting its stride or, it's been around, but it's starting to really do an uptake. So let's get now to our conversation with Faisal Durrani, talking about real estate in Saudi Arabia, giga projects, hotel keys, tourism, you name it. We try to cover as much as possible in the short window that we had. We do have a short window with him because we will be having him back about once a month. He will be part of our regular guest contributors stable, a league of extraordinary gentlemen and women. So enjoy.
This is the main stage.
The main stage.
The main
The main
stage.
stage. This is the main
Could we
stage.
get Lucien and Hanaa to the main stage, please?
Welcoming onto the main stage for the 2030 podcast, the one and only Mr. Faisal Durrani, partner and head of research, Knight Frank Middle East, where he has grown the organization substantially to be the leading real estate consultancy in the region. Faisal will be joining us on a regular monthly basis here on the 2030 for frequent updates and insights on Saudi Arabia's real estate market, as well as that of the region, and to update us regularly on all the amazing research that Knight Frank is doing. And there really is a lot of it, and it's really the best in the business. Their latest work on Saudi Arabia includes Destination Saudi, a 71-page, beautifully produced research report on Saudi Arabia as an emerging real estate and tourism destination, which you can download and read for free at knightfrank.com. And I have right in front of me. It's amazing. Faisal, we are stoked to speak with you today. Welcome, my man.
Good afternoon, Lucien and Hannah. Thank you so much for having me on your new show. Delighted to be here.
We want to kind of jump into this report, Destination Saudi, which was recently released by Knight Frank. The report mentions a sense of growing momentum in Saudi Arabia as the kingdom races towards Vision 2030 and its deadline. And in fact, you're quoted really early on in this report, quote, "The kingdom's march toward Vision 2030 is unveiling one of the world's most dynamic economies and creating a new global economic superpower." Can you sort of expand on that and maybe talk a little bit about how real estate and developments and giga projects are sort of fueling that growth?
So as you said, what we're seeing right now is the result of His Highness's vision to transform the kingdom. We've seen Saudi Arabia emerge as the 17th trillion dollar global economy last year, which is a pretty incredible achievement, which gives you a sense of the scale and of the ambition and development that's taking place. And every aspect of Saudi's economy is currently in a phase of transformation and rebirth. And nowhere more obvious is the impact of Vision 2030 than on the real estate market. And of course, that itself is being driven by the so-called giga projects, which to date account for about $1.3 trillion worth of real estate and infrastructure projects that have been announced or are currently under construction and all due to be completed by the end of the decade. I mean, some of the data points around Vision 2030 and the real estate sector are pretty phenomenal. We're talking about more than 660,000 residential units, more than 4 million square meters of retail, more than 6 million square meters of offices, 320,000 hotel rooms, all due to be completed by the end of the decade. So unsurprisingly, that is driving a significant amount of economic activity in the kingdom, which is creating jobs in cities around the country, in particular Riyadh, where we're in the midst of an office supply shortage, which, like Dubai nearby or like Abu Dhabi, is pretty anomalous on the world stage, in that these are cities that have run out of office space in the wake of the pandemic, whereas other cities in the West are still grappling with trying to get people back into the workplace. So yes, the impact is being felt far and wide on the real estate scene.
So tell us a little bit about how foreign developers are entering the market and what they're doing to kind of contribute to everything happening in Saudi Arabia. And as you noted, it's sort of all over Saudi Arabia. And actually, your report says that a lot of foreign investors are interested in Mecca as a destination as much as Riyadh. But talk with us a little bit about how foreign developers are getting into the mix here and seizing the opportunities. Are there still foreign ownership restrictions that limit international investors' market entry?
So one of the key concerns that we have at the moment for the kingdom is the sort of mismatch between household budgets and the planned real estate products that are in the pipeline. From our survey of Saudi nationals that we published last year in our Saudi report, and again comparing that against this year's Destination Saudi report, where we've also investigated the appetites, attitudes, aspirations of Saudi-based expats, we know that the bulk of people that live in the kingdom are looking to spend no more than 1.5 million riyals on purchasing a home. However, when we look at that supply pipeline of 660,000 residential units, we know that more than half of that falls within the giga projects. And it is our understanding that the bulk of those residential units in the giga projects will be priced north of $1 million, which sort of highlights that gap between aspirations and reality. So the question then arises is, who are we building all of these luxury residential units for? Now, clearly, the answer would be to open the market up to international buyers and investors. And it isn't that the market isn't accessible for expats today. They can purchase the properties they live in. There are certain conditions attached to that. It has to be their main residence, for instance. They need to sell it should they decide to leave the kingdom. But we have seen moves by the government recently. In fact, in January this year, 5 new premium residential visa options were unveiled, one of which is directly connected to property ownership. Now, I am not a lawyer. However, we have paid very close attention to the wording of this law, which suggests that you need to own a minimum of assets with an S worth at least 4 million rials. Now, suddenly, when they're talking about multiple assets, clearly all of them cannot be your main residence. So it's perhaps opening the door to owning property for investment purposes. However, even with this new premium residential visa option, there are a couple of important restrictions worth pointing out. First of all, you've got to spend a minimum of 4 million rials, which is a significant hurdle rate for quite a few people. Also, the property must be owned outright, so it cannot have any mortgage or debt against it. And more importantly, the property must be completed. It cannot be off-plan or pre-construction. So suddenly, once again, we are limiting the proportion even of international buyers that would qualify for that visa. But you mentioned demand for the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Now, in our survey of just over 500 global high net worth individuals, what we found is that Mecca emerges as the #1 target city for a real estate investment for high net worth individuals that do not live in the kingdom. Riyadh came in second place and Medina was third. So it's quite interesting to see that Muslim high net worth individuals have an affinity towards the holy cities. And look, we all know and understand that it is the expected duty of every Muslim to perform the Hajj pilgrimage at least once in their lifetimes. So perhaps the prospect of being able to own a home in one of Islam's holiest cities is pretty appealing, is quite tantalizing, and comes with a certain prestige. Because even when we looked at the reason that they're interested in buying something in the holy cities, the #1 reason is to actually use it as a main residence. So a lot of these overseas high net worth individuals are contemplating retirement in the kingdom, which just gives you a sense of that pent up demand that is waiting overseas to gain access to the market.
Yeah, and it gives you a sense of the fact that it's, they've been putting investment and money and development into Mecca to make it more of a desirable investment opportunity. I kind of want to go back just for 1 second on the visa situation. It's something that Hanaa and I have talked about a little bit on the show. Do you think that they've added sort of these extra layers of stringent requirements because they want to introduce it and make it sort of complicated and expensive at first, and in the very kind of Saudi way of introducing new things, shway little by little, and start rolling them back? Or what do you think the strategy is there? Just speculate for us a little bit.
I mean, it would purely be speculation, but I imagine things that they are considering is doing it in phases, testing the water to try and understand what that international demand might look like. Because look, at the end of the day, we must remember that central to Vision 2030 is to deliver world-class housing for Saudi nationals, first and foremost. We saw earlier this year an update on Vision 2030 published. We're now 7 years on since the National Transformation Plan was announced. The rate of home ownership in Saudi has just crossed 60%. The goal is for that to touch 70% by the end of the decade. We're well on our way to achieving that. But as I say, first and foremost, we've got to provide world-class housing that is affordable, that is attractive, that meets the needs of a young, dynamic Saudi population that is obviously cost-conscious, given what has happened to residential values in the last 7 or 8 years.
Yeah, can I jump in here? I just had a question about that. I actually have 2 questions. One about premium residency, where I kind of want to go back to, you were talking about only one of several different tracks that you can go on. One of them is maybe targeting incredibly ultra high net worth individuals that have to come in, have a complete, relocate to Riyadh or wherever in the kingdom. So I kind of wanted to maybe think about the other ones and who else it might be attracting, and if that is contributing to a more diverse pool of talent. And then I have another question on affordability, but maybe we can get to that after the one on the premium residency visas.
Okay. All I will say is on the other visa options, they are designed to attract more talent to the kingdom, which is great. And look, I think at the end of the day, it's intrinsically linked to affordability. because what has happened to residential prices in Saudi has contributed to a slowing amount of residential transactional activity. If we look at Riyadh, for example, we've seen a 60% jump in apartment prices in the last 3 years alone. Now, clearly, people's incomes have not risen by the same rate. We've also seen interest rates rising. The cost of borrowing has gone up because Saudi, like the rest of the GCC, mirrors US fiscal policy. So we've got interest rates hovering at about 6 or 6.2% these days. And it was sub 1% 3 or 4 years ago. So we've got these couple of factors dampening the appetite to purchase. But in addition to that, something that's a bit more intangible and harder to quantify is the fact that 60% of Saudi's population is aged below 30. So this group of young Saudis is now increasingly mobile in the kingdom and are being driven by career prospects. So there's a lot of internal migration taking place, typically into Riyadh. And if you think about these young, single, unmarried Saudis with no children, no commitments, when they arrive in a big new city for the first time, their priority isn't necessarily on owning a home, it's on renting one. And historically, the type of housing stock that has been delivered for Saudis has been large, standalone family homes, 3, 4, 5 bedroom plus villas. But now you've got the younger Saudis that are actually looking for studios, 1 or 2 bedroom apartments in professionally managed build to rent stock. And that type of residential product is conspicuous by its absence, because in any major global city, be it New York, London, Dubai, or Abu Dhabi, that type of stock is available in abundance, and tenants are usually happy to pay a premium to have a concierge on the ground floor, to have a podium level with a barbecue facility, a gym, a pool, daycare facilities, conveniences on the ground floor, a supermarket, a laundry, a pharmacy. And those types of residential product are missing at the moment. So for us, that is quite a large untapped area of opportunity, is to provide that professionally managed build to rent stock, not only to cater to the young aspirational Saudis who are not sure how long they're going to stay in Riyadh or when they're going to settle down, but as the economy continues to grow and draw in expats and their families from overseas, in the first instance, those expats will be looking for rental accommodation rather than something to own. So coming back to your original question, I mean, these visas are going to play an important role in opening the door to international investors and buyers, high net worths and otherwise. But I think we are all anticipating a change in the foreign ownership laws. It's a matter of when rather than if, but we're all on standby.
That's really interesting that you say that in terms of kind of the premium kind of buildings with the facilities. I mean, I do think that there are some, but they're very few and far between, and some are in decline as well, right? You had some that were incredible in the 80s and 90s that now are, because demand went down and people were looking for villas, they weren't maintained and are now definitely not attractive to a certain segment of the society. I also think it's really interesting to think about the idea of compounds as well, which is where expats would traditionally have gone, right? They'd want to live in a gated community, but now we're thinking about, apartment buildings that might attract some of the people that are thinking about relocating to Saudi and just live in a building alongside people from all over the world. And I think that that's a really interesting shifting dynamic as well. I guess my second question originally was thinking about affordability, which kind of falls in line with this. Are there measures that are kind of being taken to address this issue and ensure that housing remains accessible to Saudi nationals, remains affordable?
I mean, the short answer is yes and no. The government obviously has a range of initiatives through programs like WAFI and Sakani that are designed to facilitate that transition from renting to owning for Saudi nationals. But the provision of affordable housing is often easier said than done, especially in a market that is growing as rapidly as Saudi. We've seen land costs soaring. I've mentioned before about the volume of real estate construction that is planned for the next 6 years. There are constraints on labor. There are constraints around the availability of raw materials. But that has to be balanced with where people's budgets are. And a piece of analysis that we carried out recently was looking at something called income multipliers. So essentially, how many years of salary you need to save in order to be able to buy a villa or an apartment in any given neighborhood in Saudi. And typically, anything with a multiplier of more than 6 years anywhere in the world is considered unaffordable. Because what you would do is you'd put down a deposit of, say, 20 or 25%, and the rest you'd secure through a mortgage or debt financing of some sort. But we've got neighborhoods to the north of Riyadh where now the income multiplier to own a villa is in excess of 20 times your annual salary. And that's saving every rial. And look, that sounds really expensive, but we've got other locations in the world where it is far, far higher. To own a villa on the Palm Jumeirah, you need 65 years of your income. For central London, it's even higher than that. In Chelsea and Kensington and Westminster. So there are locations where it is more expensive, but in a local context, we've reached what is considered affordable. For Riyadh, apartments remain relatively affordable at about 4 or 5 times your income, the average income for Riyadh. But when it comes to villas, we're talking upwards of 10 times your annual average income. So in terms of affordability, there are challenges there that need to be addressed. And there's also an issue around perception. One of the things that came out from our study that we published in Destination Saudi for Saudi-based expats is we found that the bulk of them would like to spend up to 1.5 million on buying a home. And 77% of them are super keen on owning their own home. So that depth of demand is there. But when we drill down into people on higher income brackets, so say people earning more than 40,000 riyals a month, even amongst that group, a very small proportion are willing to spend up to 3 million riyals on a home in Riyadh. And it's not so much about whether they can afford to spend 2.5 or 3 million riyals in a property. It is what they are prepared to spend or what they believe the property is worth. Because right now, I think developers also have a challenge around delivering what they have promised. The bar has been set very high by a lot of the giga projects. And I think we need to see some tangible progress. We need to see some units completed. We need to see the quality of the construction. And I think then people's perceptions around how much something should cost will change.
Is that sort of the elephant in the room, I guess? I mean, with all of the supply and sort of the big promises on, hundreds of thousands of units and houses in places like Diriyah and New Murabba, is that just, are people sort of waiting and saying, hey, because in the north where I was living at Riyadh and Hattin, there were developments of, new sort of, you call them in your report branded apartments or branded living, where as you mentioned, for these younger Saudis, especially, and expats like me that are working all the time, so they kind of need everything taken care of. And I guess my sort of question is, you have all these developments going on kind of in the north of Riyadh and other places in Riyadh as well. I'm speaking just about Riyadh. And then you have these sort of like big giga projects that promise hundreds of thousands of units of supply. Is the market sort of just waiting for them or just taking a look and see approach? Or what are you kind of seeing specifically in Riyadh?
I think, look, as I say, I think the bar has been set very high because when we did an investigation into which giga projects Saudi expats would like to most live in, we asked them a question. It was really straightforward. Assuming no restrictions on budget or ownership, which giga project would you like to own a home in to live in yourself? So not for an investment. Neom came out in first place. And then we had Jeddah Central and King Salman Park. Those were the top 3. And this was through respondents around the kingdom. Now, I'm pretty sure if we could have access to the size of the marketing budgets of these giga projects, the rankings would probably be almost the same. These giga projects have done a phenomenal job in promoting themselves, not just in the kingdom, but around the world. And when we sort of probed on why NEOM is so attractive to you to buy a home in, to live in, the number one response was its association or affiliation with Vision 2030. It is sort of seen as the crown jewel in His Highness's vision for the kingdom. The second biggest reason for NEOM was that there is a promise of it being a sustainable development, which is another interesting conversation on its own. And then in third place was the promise of world-class education, so schools and universities. And I think it's those promises that people are looking forward to, and in a way that almost highlights where the opportunity in the market lies. It tells you the kinds of things that people are looking for, whether they're thinking about a residential community, a residential compound, or an apartment building, or a city. Those are the things that are drawing in the next generation of buyers. And when it comes to places like Jeddah Central or King Salman Park, I mean, when we asked Saudi nationals last year what their favorite giga project was, we had NEOM in first place, we had Diriyah Gate in second place, and Red Sea Project in third place. And I think it's pretty clear to everybody that the Red Sea Project or Red Sea Global is a holiday homes destination. It's a second homes market. And somewhere like Diriyah Gate, with the recent branded residential product that they've launched, the Baccarat residences, the Ritz residences, I think it's also pretty clear that it is targeting a very specific segment and a specific demographic of the population, the high-income earners. It isn't for everybody, not yet anyway. And so perhaps the attention is turning towards developments that people believe will be more affordable or are being positioned in that way. So, the Roshan developments, for example, have been hugely successful in selling their product for that very reason. So I think there's, it's becoming an increasingly complex market with a lot of different moving parts. But the fact that everything is still in flux and being developed, and we don't really have products that we can walk around and touch walls, I think the demand and the appeal of some of these giga projects will change quite quickly once there is physical, tangible progress, and people start moving into some of these neighborhoods.
Hanaa, which would you choose? I want to ask you both that question because I'm fascinated by that question. I'll start with you, Hanaa, give Faisal time to prepare his answer. But if you had to live in a giga project now and you're being approached by Knight Frank for a survey and cost is not an issue, what are you choosing?
I choose the rig.
That's technically not a giga project, but that's very sort of doomsday preppers of you. Okay, I'm coming back to you, Hanaa. Faisal, what would you choose if you were presented the same question?
I'd probably, it's very subjective, of course, but I'd probably choose perhaps Red Sea Global, just because it would be coastal living. And it is, amongst one of the most advanced in terms of development and construction. And that is a very beautiful part of the world. So waking up and having uninterrupted views over the Red Sea, I think that is pretty appealing.
That sounds pretty awesome.
Assuming, of course, I've got enough income multipliers to own that.
No, I'm giving this to you free, so yeah.
I'm waiting for the Eastern Province Giga Project, which is why the rig is what comes up, right? That's where I want to be. I want to be on the Gulf. So for me, it's being close to home. And that's, as a Saudi, what's important to me.
So that's
what about you, Lucien? You can't escape this one.
So I'm going Diriyah, because for the same thing you were talking about earlier, Faisal, you can kind of look and see and touch and feel it now. They're starting to roll out very small numbers of very expensive houses at the Corinthian and other sort of branded residences there, and you can kind of see where they're going eventually. But you can see the Nejd style of architecture. It's like they're kind of rolling out their project showroom by showroom, almost, it feels like to me. I mean, I would also say Numaraba, because who doesn't want to live or adjacent to a giant cube? And that seems amazing. But like, that seems very, I can't really get my head around it in terms of what it is. It kind of speaks to what you were talking about earlier, Faisal. And You mentioned this earlier. We could talk. There's so much stuff just to get to in this report. There's so much to talk about. I think a good way to kind of wrap this up, and because there's so much to talk about, to have you back, is if we could talk a little bit about tourism, because it's a subject of importance to Saudi Arabia. We talk about it on the show a lot. And this report does an amazing job kind of outlining, hey, like these are all the things going on with Saudi tourism. And it's not just events or things to do, it's developments, it's new airports and, giga projects as well, obviously tie into that. But then you have the World Cup. The way that it's presented in this report is the coming tourism boom, even though they've already hit their numbers for tourism for 2030 way ahead of schedule. My question is is there a way for, two parts really, is there a way for investors who see this, read this report and say, I want in on this? How can they get in on this? And then if you could talk a little bit about where you see the tourism sector going in terms of contributing to Saudi Arabia's diversification in the years really running up until 2034, which is the World Cup.
I think, look, tourism is expected to play a significant role in diversifying Saudi's economy. We've just hit 50% of GDP coming from the non-oil sector, which is a new record for the kingdom. And in terms of tourism, historically, as Hanaa will well know, that has been driven predominantly by religious tourism. So people coming into Jeddah and then traveling to the holy cities for Hajj pilgrimages, for instance. However, we're now seeing a more concerted national effort in creating tourism infrastructure that means we have a wider range of tourism offerings that appeals to every budget and that appeals to every age demographic, local as well as international. What's fascinating about the Saudi tourism market at the moment is last year we had about 77 million domestic trips made. So right now, the biggest source market for tourists are Saudis themselves, who are eager to explore the country and see what the latest new project is that the government has unveiled. As I mentioned at the very beginning, we've currently got about 320,000 hotel rooms that are planned or under construction due to be delivered in the next 6 years. And for context, today, Dubai has 154,000 ready hotel rooms, which is higher than London or higher than New York. So we're talking about building basically double the number of hotel rooms that Dubai has in Saudi in the next 6 years. That is a significant amount of hotel room supply. And about close to 70% of that falls within the 4 and 5 star category. And for us, a really interesting area of opportunity is we know from the World Trade Organization to run a 4 or 5 star hotel room, you need between 1 to 2 staff per room. So very roughly, we're talking about creating between 200 to 400,000 new jobs in the hospitality sector alone, which gives you an indication again of the size of that sector, purely 4 and 5 star, and its potential contribution to future economic growth. But sort of going full circle and bringing it back to real estate, the big question is, where are all these people going to live? They certainly can't afford to rent, and they certainly can't afford house prices where they are today. So a big area of opportunity that we see in the market is around what we call key worker accommodation. This is not labor accommodation. This is accommodation for your housekeeping staff, your chefs, your receptionists, your bellboys, your concierge guys. And we have examples of that type of accommodation elsewhere in the Middle East, and it's a great investment grade asset. Yields can be as high as 10%. It helps with staff attraction and retention. They get free transport to and from the hotel. They get their linen changed every day. They get access to communal facilities. It's a really, really investor-friendly asset. And right now, we're not really seeing developers in Saudi tap into that segment again of the residential market. And again, here, I'm only talking about the hospitality sector. There's obviously the retail sector and other sectors connected to aviation as well, with the new airlines that are coming, Riyadh Air, Neom Air. So yes, it is going to, to sum it up, tourism is going to play a very significant role in driving future economic growth.
And many tourists will visit your future home at the Red Sea, where you will have a very posh villa when we IPO the 2030 podcast. And Hannah will be on the rig hanging out in one of the hotel rooms just so she can be adjacent to the EP, as I like joking with her about. Faisal Durrani, partner and head of research, Knight Frank Middle East. Toss Faisal a follow on LinkedIn. If you're on LinkedIn, I know a lot of our listeners and viewers are on LinkedIn. Great guy to follow on LinkedIn because he's sharing this research all the time, as he will be doing on this podcast as well. But really good stuff coming from Knight Frank. And Faisal, thank you so much for your time. This was great.
Thank you, Lucien. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you so much.
Let's get to the news.
Let's get to the news. So this is an interesting one, considering Hajj season is literally right around the corner. Saudi Arabia is installing Saudi-made heat-proof surfacing in Mecca ahead of the Hajj. So Saudi Arabia's General Authority of Roads has just used a new technology on asphalt surfaces around the Namira Mosque that cools the surfaces down and reduces the temperature for pilgrims. The modern technology uses white paint from locally made materials that have the ability to absorb less solar radiation. This
makes a lot of sense to me, because these are roads that are not necessarily being driven on. This is a Hajj, right? So it's a pilgrimage. So people are walking, and you need a surface that it's easier to walk on. There's a lot of walking going on, but black asphalt seems like an absolutely terrible choice. And the conversation of, white roads, they call them, or roads that are not just like blacktop or black surface or asphalt, has been around for some time, because we've been doing it with buildings for a long time. We've been painting the tops of buildings white so that there's a reflection of the sun and it doesn't absorb heat into the building, especially in hot places. But for roads, you can't do it if you're driving on the roads, because if it's a white road, it's really bright in the sun. So you kind of can't see. I mean, you're cool, but you can't see. But this is an interesting application. There's a photo of it actually on the SPA. It doesn't look white. It just doesn't look black. And so we're actually going to include it in the news, the video news segment we have, because I saved it. And it's interesting because it's not totally dark. But, look, every degree helps in June in Mecca. I haven't been there, but I can only assume. So pretty cool.
Yeah, the official spokesman for the General Authority of Roads, Abdulaziz Al-Atabi, confirmed a statement to SPA that the road cooling mechanism is scientifically implemented by reflecting sunlight and reducing temperatures during the day and night. The product used seeks to create more comfortable and easier environments in pedestrian areas in a desire to create a healthy environment and a better quality of life.
I just bought a black car, and it's already noticeably warmer when you park it in the sun. And I kind of forgot about that. And so, yeah, this is a thing. It's really cool that they're doing this. It can be interesting to see how it works. If this is a new technology, or at least a new application of a new technology around Mecca, I wonder if it can be used elsewhere. Riyadh is also hot. Many other places in the region are hot. So I'd be interested to learn more about the technology and who owns it, where it came from. This is made in Saudi. Some of these, whatever goes into it. So I don't know, kind of cool. Definitely needed. Number 2, deals are slowing in Saudi Arabia. The kingdom closed the fewest number of first quarter investment deals since 2021. In a further sign, the kingdom is struggling to attract funding from private companies and foreign investors. This is according to a Bloomberg report. The kingdom finalized 64 transactions in the first 3 months of 2024, according to data from the Ministry of Investment. That's down 40% on a year earlier. The count is slightly below that recorded in the fourth quarter of last year, Bloomberg reported. Go. I'll just jump in here. So this is not great news, because you just hear it over and over again. Foreign investment attraction, foreign investment into the kingdom. You see it with the Aramco stock sale. You see it with giga projects. That's the name of the game. The name of the game is economic diversification. The fastest way to do it is to have foreign investors coming in, setting up their companies, doing deals, investing locally. So they're all kind of part of the same thing. And, you see this and you say, okay, it's down 40% from a year earlier. But you also had, right now is a time of significant economic growth and expansion for Saudi Arabia, and really a total change in how the kingdom's economy works. And we've been talking about it for 8 years. You and I have been talking about it for 3 months or whatever it is, 2 months that we've been doing this. It's something that seems like, well, when's it going to happen? Like, it's taking forever. It actually is going so quickly. It's kind of hard to really wrap your head around when you think about the time frame for a total economic change like this. So you're going to have these periods, quarters where it leaps ahead and there's a ton of deals. And sometimes it happens around events. Sometimes it's other events, externalities that cause them. And then sometimes you just have a slow period. Doesn't mean that, oh no, it's not going well. It's like, well, since 2021, okay, but Vision 2030 is 2016, 2017. So you're going to have these down quarters, maybe even down years. It's not bad. So you keep going, but I think this is an interesting kind of data point saying, hey, look, it's not just a total straight line up. It's it's a journey. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, and just to add one thing to that is, the deals that have been signed need to come to maturity. They're being established. Some of these deals are, multi-year, multi-decade projects, and therefore they're ongoing. And I think that it's important to remember that these deals aren't short term. A lot of them are not. And therefore, I think that there's still a lot happening despite the occasional slowdown.
Deal flow. I love it. Thanks for chiming into that one, by the way. I thought you were just going to let me take it all the way. It's a negative topic. It's not great, but we're not just going to, yeah.
It is a piece of news from Bloomberg. So clearly it's very relevant. And number 3, Jordan has foiled 2 plots to smuggle. A lot of negative here, but this is actually a very positive.
It's a good one.
News,
yeah.
Right?
Hold
Jordan
on.
has foiled 2 plots. Stop. Okay. Bad news when you talk about drugs. Anyway.
It's the
good news
the
when you
foiling
foil it,
of
right?
smuggling. It's not
Foil it,
that they
okay.
got them in successfully. Continue.
So Jordan has foiled 2 plots to smuggle millions of Captagon pills through a border post to Saudi Arabia. Jordan has foiled millions of Captagon pills, the biggest seizure in years of drugs bound for lucrative Gulf markets, from what Jordanian security officials say are the Syria-based gangs with ties to Iran. The haul was discovered hidden in a shipment of construction vehicles at the Umari crossing in Jordan's eastern desert before it was due to enter Saudi, officials told Reuters on Wednesday.
Yeah, Narcos, Arabia. The drug smuggling situation is getting more and more sophisticated. It's a similar playbook that happens in the Americas, where you have a very wealthy market in North America and you have a supplier market that is not as wealthy in South America. You don't have direct jurisdiction from North American authorities over South America. You can do your best as the U.S. government to dissuade cocaine or drug production in Latin America. And that's not all where all of the drugs come from in America, but cocaine certainly does. But there's only so much you can do. In addition to that, cocaine is produced in Latin America in very mountainous regions, usually in Colombia or Peru. So even if you knew where these things were and you wanted to stop the production of cocaine, very, very difficult. In the Middle East, it is happening in Syria. And what has happened is with the civil war that was ongoing in Syria and the sort of fractured government and the political situation in Syria, that's where Captagon is now being manufactured in massive quantities and shipped all around the region. The margins on the Captagon is so significant that you have this sort of, from the cartels or the producers, you have a laissez-faire attitude about whether or not they are seized or taken or lost because you're making so much and the profit margin's so big. So when you have a big sort of bust like this at the border, especially in Saudi Arabia, and it always involves collaboration with your border authorities on the other side, Jordan, wherever it is, you're stopping it from there. It just sort of shows that the sort of Gulf Arab states are working together to stop this, because Captagon is not like a light drug, and it's not, something that they want in the kingdom at all. So they're working really hard on this, and it's the customs authorities that are doing a really good job with this. That's really their task. I mean, border security, and there's military involved, obviously, but it's customs stopping these things from coming in. So yeah, they do not want a big underground drug culture or drug scene in Saudi Arabia. So I thought that this was a good story because, it shows a very proactive stance from the Saudi government saying, we don't want this and we're not going to tolerate this.
No, absolutely. But actually, even within Saudi Arabia, there is a very, very kind of active campaign against drugs. I think that it's led by the Ministry of Interior, and it is, if they do make it into the border, which inevitably this happens, right? There's definitely heavy penalties, but at the same time, there is just a really, really big awareness campaign that's been ongoing for a couple of years. So you get messages on your phone constantly about, kind of the importance of obviously like not doing drugs, but also being very vigilant about the drug trade. So I think it's something that needs to be kind of mentioned, I guess. Like it's front and center in a lot of people's minds on how important it is to really raise awareness about the dangers of the drugs that are coming through and, making it around security measures.
Yeah. I mean, no country in the world is worse than America at that. And that's something that we need badly here is awareness campaigns. And we always have to have them ongoing about the various drugs like opioids and things like that. And then fentanyl. So like the number one thing you can do in addition to like whatever your best effort is at stopping things in the border is educating the public about the dangers of these drugs. So
exactly.
Especially with things like Captagon and things that are made illegally, pharmaceuticals that are made illegally are dangerous because there's no standardization process in making them. So anyway.
Yeah. But the other thing about that is like a pill just seems so harmless to people if you're not really thinking about it, versus whatever. There are other ways of taking drugs that are really scary that you learn about when you're a kid, like with needles. And that is something that is a lot more obvious. But when you are thinking about just taking what looks like medicine without these awareness campaigns, especially younger people are much more vulnerable to being susceptible to kind of getting tricked. And then obviously the addiction levels for a lot of these illegal drugs are so high because of the way they're prepared. So.
Yeah. Okay. A good story coming up here. Hanaa, Saudi Arabia's launched a new strategy aimed at making itself a hub for semiconductor design. The kingdom announced the National Semiconductor Hub Wednesday of this week to develop so-called fabless chip companies that design new semiconductors. The goal is to draw 50 firms to the kingdom by 2030, and the focus will be on simple chips rather than cutting-edge and politically sensitive technologies. Manufacturing will be done internationally, at least in the medium term, according to Naveed Sherwani, head of the new hub, and this was all reported in Bloomberg.
Sherwani said, "We're not trying to replace NVIDIA or challenge Intel. We want to do humble beginnings. Once we have built a base, then we can talk." So the initiative underscores the increasing importance of semiconductors for Saudi as Crown Prince Royal Highness Hamad bin Salman seeks to tap into new industries that will help the country draw in more revenue from non-oil activities. Sherwani said that Alat may eventually be involved in conversations around how new chip design companies in Saudi Arabia can manufacture at home. For now, the focus will be on relocating and establishing new fabless chip farms. 3 have already signed up for the program and 10 others have asked to join, he said.
This is interesting because you just mentioned it, but Alat may be involved. This seems like this is right up their alley. They're looking to get tech to be manufactured in Saudi Arabia. That's not what's happening here at first. They're kind of looking to just get things going. And the best way to do that is just to start and have a medium to long-term horizon about manufacturing. They also are keeping in mind like the U.S. government and U.S. policy on choosing between U.S. or Chinese tech and as the home to OpenAI and NVIDIA. I think you want to go with the number one country on this, but the U.S. government has basically said, look, because of security and sensitivity issues, hacking, all these other challenges that come with this, at some point there may be a choice you have to make on these subjects and these industries. And that was sort of communicated by the U.S. government. And then you saw the CEO of Alat say that recently, say, look, if they're ultimately looking for us to divest, we will divest. Again, this is not Alat. This is a different thing. But this is one of the better, more positive stories about Saudi Arabia you can read. Seeing them investing in things like, hubs for semiconductors, for chips, things like that, I think could be really good for the Saudi economy in the long run.
Absolutely. And OPEC Plus agreed to extend most of its deep oil output cuts well into 2025. Was this yours? Were you supposed to read this?
No, because you read the first one. So you're odd numbers. Didn't I just read? Yes, I did.
Did you? Okay.
We are. Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm just running late, so I'm thinking about it. Okay. OPEC Plus agreed to extend most of its deep oil output cuts well into 2025. So OPEC Plus agreed this week to extend its output cuts as the group seeks to shore up the market amid tepid demand growth, high interest rates, and rising rival U.S. production. Brent crude oil prices have been trading near $80 per barrel in recent days, below what many OPEC Plus members need to balance their budgets. And OPEC Plus members are currently cutting output by a total of 5.86 million barrels per day, or about 5.7% of global demand. So those include 3.6 million barrels per day of cuts, which were due to expire at the end of 2024, and voluntary cuts by 8 members of 2 million barrels per day, expiring at the end of June 2024.
Interesting to see, and we talked about this on episode 11, and sort of the relation with the Aramco share sale. There isn't a strong relationship there, but it just so happened that the share sale was announced, and pretty much on the same day or day or two after, they had this big OPEC Plus meeting. Just a few things that are going on here. China demand growth is kind of going down a little bit. That puts downward pressure on prices. You also have rising oil stocks around the world, especially in developing countries, especially in developed countries, I should say, which is limiting demand. So you kind of have OPEC Plus with Saudi at the top saying, how do we manage this, keep prices where they are? They really wanted prices up more toward $100, and probably not going to happen. You had Saudi Energy Minister Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman saying, quote, "We are waiting for interest rates to come down and a better trajectory when it comes to economic growth, not pockets of growth here and there," essentially saying that the global macroeconomic landscape is not very clear one way or the other. So just a good oil update, which is, as we noted earlier, still important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's always what people are thinking about when they think about Saudi, isn't it? So it's important to keep people updated.
Until 2030, and then there'll be a magical moment when we no longer talk about oil. Just kidding. But it is important for the diversification because you kind of need the money to finance these things. So with that, I know you have to go. Dr. Dora, thank you very much.
Thank you.